Good morning. It's Chapter 23, Lecture B for this week. We'll get going. Today we're going to talk about the Korean War. Origins of Cold War number 6 if you're following along on your slides. So yesterday we left off about the growing communist challenge around the world. Big thing that's going to happen during Truman's presidency after the fall of China and after the Soviets detonated the bomb. Is going to be the Korean War. It's often the forgotten war people don't talk a lot about. Occupied by Japan during World War II, it was divided in 1944 into a Soviet, or 45 into a Soviet American zones, much like Germany, but instead of east and west, it's north and south. In June of 1950, the North Korean army invaded the south, hoping to reunify the country under communist control under the original Kim. I can't remember his last or his first name. So the Kim's is the last name. In the Korean, it goes Kim whatever. It's reversed, obviously. So it'd be like Martin Brock instead of Brock Martin. So this was the start of the Kim dynasty because it goes Kim Jong.
Was it Il?
I think it was Il. I think you're right. I was about to say because it's Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Sung, and then it's Kim Jong Un. I believe is the order. Now, quickly occupied most of the peninsula. The Truman administration persuaded the United Nations Security Council to authorize the use of force to repel the invasion. The way the Security Council goes, there's 5 permanent members, and then there's a rotating 9 or 10 members that rotate in and off. But the 5 permanent members can veto any action, and if any one of the 5 vetoes, that means the UN will not respond. Now you can say, well, who was the 5 Security Council members at this time? There was the 5 were the United States, Great Britain, France, China, which was Taiwan, not the People's Republic of China, and the 5th one was the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet Union would reject this, right? They would veto it, thus ending UN aid. Ironically enough, the Soviet Union was protesting the UN at this point, and were not there present to vote. And so their vote was just nullified, and thus UN action was sanctioned.
It went Sung, Il, or Soon, Sung, Il, and then Un.
Okay, so it was Sung, then Il, then, okay. Yeah. Now, they only passed Security Council because Soviet Union was boycotting the UN over UN refusal to seat Communist China. That's what it was. Now, American forces did the bulk of the fighting under the leadership of Douglas MacArthur initially. There's this brilliant attack known as Incheon. Took most of North Korea, got too close to the Chinese border. We got too close to the Chinese border. Thousands of Chinese flooded into North Korea as we got closer to the border. Thus, unofficially, China joined the war on the side of North Korea. MacArthur wanted to push back and even question using tactical nuclear weapons. MacArthur questioned Truman's authority during this whole engagement. And I actually did quite a bit of research on this in college. Essentially, MacArthur was operating as his own diplomat. He was representing himself, and he thought he represented the United States at his own latitude, meaning he could make policy, right? Does generals make policy? No, the answer is no. Generals don't make policy. Politicians do. It's part of our checks and balances. MacArthur thought he was better and smarter than Truman. In one essay or theory, he wrote he wanted to place 5 tactical nuclear bombs, actually some estimates, I think he said 40, along the border between North Korea and China. 1 tactical nuclear bomb would have been devastating enough, let alone 5 or 40, right? Or 20, I don't remember I know 5 was one of the original numbers proposed. Could you imagine? Well, why would he want to place 5 nuclear bombs along the border? Drop them. What would that create? A zone of what?
Radiation.
Yeah, contamination, right? On the surface level, that's a brilliant strategy. On the humane, realistic, environmental, that's devastating, right? Truman refused. MacArthur publicly criticized the president for refusing his idea. So what does Truman do?
Fires back.
He fires him.
Oh.
MacArthur even sent his demands to China and sent threats to China. Truman could not have this undermining his authority, undermining the U.S. military, etc. So he fires MacArthur. MacArthur is welcomed home as a hero, very unpopular move. If you actually do polls now and studies, like Truman's favorability or approval rating plummeted after this. But today, if you look at his numbers, they're very good. Because now we could retrospect, was that the right decision? Yeah, absolutely. After MacArthur's firing, war settled into stalemate around the 38th parallel. Not till 1953 was an armistice agreed to and signed. No formal peace treaty ending the Korean War. They've actually been working on one here to actually end the formal war. North and South Korea have been an open dialogue. No formal peace, like I said. More than 33,000 Americans will die in the Korean War. So going on to this next slide, the origins of the Cold War 7. Now, this really kicks the Cold War off, right? So the blockade of Berlin is one of the first frays into that. The aid to Greece, the Marshall Plan. But now, for the first time, America is willing to commit to war to stop the spread of communism. Yeah, we wanted to liberate South Korea, but the reality was we didn't want communism to spread, right? We are taking the initiative now to stop communism with war.
How come we did that with them and didn't do that with the Soviet Union?
Well, we're not directly at war with the Soviet Union, are we?
Well, but they're communism and we were trying to stop it.
Part of the containment was we'd allow it where it already existed. We just didn't want it to spread. That's a good question. So clarity there. Good question brought up. Why didn't we attack the Soviet Union directly then? Well, we weren't necessarily trying to eradicate communism where it already existed. We were just trying to stop its spread. Cold War critics. Soviet Union had created a brutal dictatorship with few liberties. A number of contemporary critics pointed out casting the Cold War in terms of worldwide battle between freedom and slavery had unfortunate consequences. Which the reality is that means the United States is going to be dragged into a lot of wars that we really don't care about, rather than it's communism versus democracy. Some argued that after Korea, the view of stopping slavery, communism, would require the United States to intervene continuously in other nations across the world, meaning we are going to have to be involved all the time. Now, this gets played into imperialism and decolonization. World War II showed America the problems of imperialism and colonies it created around the world. America backed away from demanding the end of colonial rule, because the end of colonial rule would mean you have a lot of these governments fracturing, allowing the coming in of communist governments, right? So it's a double-edged sword for us. Any country that stood up against communism was considered a member of the free world. So if you stood up against communism, no matter how bad a person you were, hey, you're a friend of the world. Here's a video on the history of the Korean War.
At the end of the Second World War, and emerging from nearly 4 decades of brutal Japanese occupation, the Korean peninsula found itself torn between two foreign ideologies, from the Soviet Union and the United States. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union occupied the communist wing of the Korean resistance, all of the land north of the 38th parallel, while the United States occupied Korea south of the line. The Communist North was equipped with over 200,000 armed veterans who fought alongside Mao Zedong's Chinese Red Army against the Japanese, and then against Chiang Kai-shek in China's own bloody civil war. Their leader was Kim Il-sung, who saw the United States appointing former Japanese collaborators to top leadership positions in the South. His intent was to unite Korea under one communist ideology. By contrast, the unstable South was ill-equipped to defend itself compared to the battle-seasoned and well-supplied North. From 1945 to 1950, the South, under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, suffered massive civil unrest, often dealing with popular demonstrations with violent police retaliation, employing tactics reminiscent of the Japanese occupation. Following years of cross-border raids and skirmishing along the 38th parallel, Kim Il-sung invaded the South on June 25, 1950, behind a barrage of artillery fire. Syngman Rhee was forced to flee Seoul 2 days later. On the third day of fighting, the South bombed the bridge crossing the Han River and were in full retreat from the North's advance. On the day of the invasion in 1950, the United Nations Security Council in New York roundly condemned North Korea's action, with veto-wielding Russia infamously absent from the session. 2 days later, Security Council Resolution 83 was passed, recommending UN member states assist South Korea militarily. And with that, American President Harry Truman ordered the U.S. Navy and Air Force, based mostly in Japan at the time, into action on behalf of the South. Less than 2 months since the invasion began, Kim Il-sung had driven the South Korean and U.S. forces to Pusan in the southeast corner of the peninsula and was expecting an imminent and total victory in the war. At the time, China decided to position more than 250,000 of its troops along its Korean border, should the conflict escalate and the North's advance be repelled. After weeks of fighting around Pusan, the U.S. had significantly reinforced the South, while American bombers degraded the supply lines and troop strength of the North. The army of Kim Il-sung was forced to retreat. Only 25,000 North Korean soldiers ever managed to rejoin their northern ranks. The South's counterattack successfully pushed across the 38th parallel and, along with U.S. forces, captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. In response, China ordered its troops to cross into North Korea and repel the South Korean counteroffensive on October 25, 1950. Following 2 months of brutally contested warfare, U.S. and South Korean forces were expelled from North Korea back across the 38th parallel. By January 4, 1951, North Korea had captured Seoul for a second time. However, as before following its invasion of the South in June 1950, North Korea lacked the logistical support to supply any further pursuit of the South. This gave U.S. and South Korean troops time to quickly regroup, rearm, and retake Seoul. After 6 weeks of back-and-forth fighting, the U.S. launched a full-scale assault against the North Korean and Chinese forces in February 1951. For the rest of the year, fighting continued around the 38th parallel, steadily degrading into World War I-style trench warfare, brutal and mechanical. As casualties mounted on both sides, efforts at negotiating a ceasefire grew. However, several attempts at diplomacy were thwarted throughout 1952 and into 1953. With Korean civilian casualties approaching 3 million, a proposal was finally accepted by the United Nations, and an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The result led the embittered North and South Koreans to create a demilitarized zone roughly along the 38th parallel, which has perpetuated the hostility of the two countries for 6 decades and counting.
Okay. Pretty good little summary of the war. The Cold War and the idea of freedom. The Cold War was an ideological struggle, hearts and minds campaign. It was anti-communist movies and creation of the CIA will come of it. In the 50s, movies that you've never even thought of, like the invasion of the body snatchers, what is it, the day the world stood still or the earth stood still, stuff like that, are all metaphors for communism and the fear of it. Now, freedom and totalitarianism, or as a term originated in Europe between the world wars to describe fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. It's basically total regime control, right? Aggressive, ideological-driven states that sought to subdue all civil society. This idea of totalitarianism greatly exaggerated the totality of government control of private life and thought in these countries. Cold War reshaped this understanding of freedom once again. So, you can see, as we get into the 50s, we're going to talk about this totality of these government controls, right? So we're going to see what happened in Italy, Germany, and even to some degree fascist Spain, and how these suppressive regimes worked. Now that we're in the Cold War, we're saying, hey, the Soviet Union, communism are representative of the same tyranny, right? We're connecting the dots here. So we're trying to convince the world that those are bad. You're also going to have the rise of human rights. World War II forcibly raised the issue of human rights. Obviously, the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews and other groups, is going to bring this to the forefront. Nazi officials were put on trial and some were executed for these war crimes. In 1948, the UN General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, it lacked an enforcement mechanism on that declaration. Ambiguous of human rights. One reason for the lack of enforcement was the United States and the Soviet Union refused to accept outside interference in their internal affairs. So even though we create this, we are not willing, nor is the Soviet Union willing, for these things to be enacted in our own countries. NAACP did file a petition with the United States or United Nations saying, hey, the African American plight would fall under this. Soviets claimed to provide all citizens with social and economic rights, but violated democratic rights and civil liberties for freedom of choice and opportunity. Now, the Truman presidency, 1. The fair deal. Truman had to overhaul or oversee a transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, which is not easy to do. More than 12 million men remained in uniform in August of 1944. Divorce rates rose. Some took advantage of the GI Bill, but still the economy is going to slag in 1945 to 46. Majority will return to the labor force. Why 2 million women lost their jobs and will be sent back home for let the husband work. Truman tried to revive the stalled momentum of the New Deal, the Fair Deal, but called for increase in minimum wage, enact a program of national health insurance, and expand public housing, Social Security, and aid to education, but it's not going to be super successful. After the war had avoided pretty much all strikes, but the post-war strikes, people advocating better working conditions, better pay, are going to happen. 1946, Operation Dixie campaign to bring unionization to the South was launched by the AFL and CIO. Inflation soared across the country following the removal of price controls, resulted in the largest strike wave in American history. 5 million workers, including steel, auto, and coal, are going to walk off their jobs. So Truman instantly faced with a lot of crisis economically, right? So before he even has to deal with the Berlin blockade, before he has to deal with communist China, the Korean War, he's got to deal with the economic problems that the war has brought. Yes, America's out of the Great Depression. Now, naturally, post-war, you're going to have a decline economically for a period. How do you avoid going backwards and having a huge recession? So, this is going to lead to the resurgence of the Republicans. The Democrats had dominated since the early 30s all the way up to really the 40s. Now the Republicans had made some gains on FDR. They're going to come full steam against Truman. In 1946, a large number of middle-class voters, alarmed by the labor turmoil and the fear of communism, are going to turn Republican. For the first time since the 20s, Republicans swept to control both houses of Congress. So Truman did not have control of either house. Operation Dixie failed to unionize the South, but it did send a message. Congress turned aside Truman's Fair Deal program and enacted tax cuts for wealthy Americans, and 47 passed over Truman's veto. The Taft-Hartley Act sought to reverse some of the gains gained by organized labor in the past decade. Post-Civil War rights. Civil rights between 45 and 51, 11 states from New York to New Mexico established the employment of fair practices, basically ending discrimination and fair public accommodations. In 1952, for the first time since recorded keeping began 70 years early, no lynching took place in the United States. So you start to see, during the Truman presidency, civil rights take center action. 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their team, and this is going to open the door to baseball to be desegregated. So you can see there's a lot of items going on here. Now, as a little bit of stop, we're going to stop here probably for today. We're already at a pretty good length, and tomorrow I'll finish up the lecture. You can see Truman has a lot of stuff on his plate. This fear in the country is going to be great. Okay. Is this going to be easy for Truman to fix? No. So in 1948, it is not known if Truman's going to win re-election. It's one of those things we don't really know if he is going to be able to muster up a re-election. Now, I will tell you, he's going to win, and we'll talk about that here in a second, or talk about it tomorrow. Any questions thus far? Truman had to balance a lot. I'm telling you, Truman, at the end of the day, when you stack presidents, obviously you have Lincoln, Washington usually at the top. But I'm telling you, the things Truman had to deal with, you can put him right up there with the big boys. In fact, I think you can rank Truman ahead of FDR. I really do. And I'm not just saying it because I'm from Missouri, but I just think at the end of the day, Truman is one of the most underscored presidents. By the way, Truman, just to understand, he made a lot of big decisions, and probably the right decisions, was the only 20th century president not to go to college or have a college degree. So, have a good day. A couple things. Chapter 23 reaction quiz is up. It is an easier one this week. It involves your book. Get that completed. Get that churned in. Chapter 23 quiz will be posted Friday. A study guide is up for the test. You can go online, look at the study guide. The test will be next Wednesday. And I'm probably going to make the test all online. It's not open book, open note, but I'm going to make it a digital format. That way you guys can churn it in and complete it, okay? Especially for those people that are multiple hours or off campus. That way I don't have to track down papers, okay? All right, have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.